Welcome to the Gamer's Encyclopedia, an informative series detailing the histories of long-running or important series in gaming history. Well, last time I said I'd be doing an RPG series that would be really hard to put in order without looking it up. And I gotta say, some of the guesses posted makes me wonder if you guys have brain damage. I mean, really? Final Fantasy? Dragon Quest? Those are numbered! No, you don't need to post to tell me why you guessed that, because it's definitely brain damage. I mean, wow. Anyway, as you already know from the title of the video, this week I'm doing the Tales of series. And if you somehow got to this portion of the video and you didn't know that, well, yeah, brain damage. The Tales of series is a loose series of RPGs with a strong action element that started way back in 1995 for the Super NES and continues to this day. The series is not as popular as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Pokemon, or other Japanese RPGs, but it is fairly well known, and if you're an RPG fan, chances are you might have played one of these at one point or another. Each game in the series tends to have its own story and continuity, but sometimes there are sequels. This was also one of the series that I had considered doing for clearing confusion, as it's hard to put them in order without doing the work to research it, and there's some weird anomalies such as two games with pretty much the same title which are unrelated. But that being said, I chose not to do it back then, but I choose to do it now. So let's take a look at the first game, Tales of Fantasia. Tales of Fantasia was developed by Wolf Team, that's the Super NES and PlayStation version, and Namco Tales Studio for Game Boy Advance. The PSP version was done by Mindloader. It was published by Namco, and the international version of the Game Boy Advance one was published by Nintendo. There's 4 versions. The first was for the Super NES and released in Japan on December 15, 1995, and never released anywhere else. The PlayStation version was released in Japan on December 23, 1998, and was also Japan only. The Game Boy Advance version came out in Japan on August 1, 2003, in America on March 6, 2006, and in Europe on March 31, 2006, finally giving the rest of the world a version of the game, though it took 3 years to localize, I guess. Finally, the PlayStation Portable version came out in Japan on September 6, 2006, and then was re-released in Japan as the Cross Edition on August 5, 2010. On Game Rankings, it holds a score of 93.50, the highest of the series. Yes, that's right, the best game in the series is the one that took us 11 years to get. Wonderful. Anyway, I actually played this one back in the day on an emulator with a fan-made translation, and while it's not the perfect RPG, it's technically very impressive for the Super NES, reminiscent of late-era RPGs like Chrono Trigger, Treasure of the Rudras, and Star Ocean in terms of the graphics and sound. The backstory involves a villain named Deus who fought against some heroes, but before he could lose, he transported himself into the future, but sucks to be him as the hero's descendants were waiting for him and sealed him away. But Deus returns, as you play as a young man named Cress who goes off hunting, then returns to his village to find it razed by a dark knight working for Deus. You wind up beating Deus, but he jumps through time again, so the rest of the game involves getting a sword that can stop him from doing that to beat him once and for all. At first glance, it looks like a pretty typical RPG, but the battles are where it becomes unusual, as it goes into a side-scrolling mode for the battles. Honestly, it's hard to compare it to a non-Tales game. The closest I could come to, believe it or not, would be Super Adventure Island 2. You mainly control Cress, though you could direct other party members. My only issue is that the camera zooms to whoever's casting a spell or attacking, which interrupts the flow of the action quite a lot, but this would be improved in the sequels. So speaking of sequels, the way the series works for the most part is that they keep the Tales of part of the title and just tack another word onto the end of it. So let's take a look at the next one, and if you're a long-time fan of the series, this may have been the first one you played. Tales of Destiny was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco. It was directed by Mutsumi Inamata. It was released for PlayStation in Japan on December 23, 1997, and in America on September 30, 1998. This one has never been released in Europe. On Game Rankings, it has a score of 73.93, the 12th highest in the series. There was a version for PlayStation 2, but as that's more of a full remake, I'm going to cover it separately. Tales of Destiny is highly reminiscent of the first game in terms of its graphics and overall presentation, and it keeps the side-scrolling battles, but it tells a completely original story unconnected to Tales of Fantasia. In this one, the world kinda sucks because a comet hit the planet long ago and caused a sort of nuclear winter-type situation. While people gain the ability to make floating cities above the constant cloud cover, only the elite can live there, creating two classes of people, the Ethers and the Earthers. I'll let you figure out which is which. Anyway, the Ethers made a nasty weapon, the Bellkrant, which can destroy pretty much anything and caused a lot of wars, and some Ethers moved back down to the planet and helped the Earthers. So what's this got to do with the game? Surprisingly little. It takes place a few thousand years after that, but it's a pretty interesting backstory, no? Anyway, you play as this kid Stan, an adventurer who stows away on an airship and gets caught and forced to work for them. But then a battle breaks out, and he finds a talking sword from the Ether Wars, and the rest of the game has to do with finding the Eye of the Atamani, an ancient relic from back then that everybody wants to get their hands on. Tales of Destiny was a pretty good game, and it did have some improvements to the battle system, but like many people, I prefer the first game. The next main game in the series would cause some confusion, but first we have a spin-off to talk about. Tales of Phantasia Narakiri Dungeon was developed by Wolf Team and published by Namco. It was released for the Game Boy Color in Japan only on November 10th, 2000. Though direct sequels to the Tales games are kind of rare, the original Tales of Phantasia did get one, actually several as it became its own series. Unfortunately, none of the actual sequels to Tales of Phantasia were released outside of Japan, but fret not, as you're not missing out on some epic game, but rather a game that may take place 205 years after the first game, but is, for all intents purposes, a spin-off. If you're wondering about the title and why I didn't translate the word Narakiri, it's because it's one of those words that really doesn't have an English analog. It basically means the act of turning into something different. This references the abilities of the characters to become anything they dress up as. Basically, this created a new type of game where you basically cosplay as characters to become them. The gameplay is a dungeon crawler type of game and actually is pretty involved plot for this type of game. Too much to really go into for what is essentially a spin-off, so if you're interested, I recommend you look into it. Anyway, let's take a look into the next game of the series, Tales of Eternia. Tales of Eternia, released in America as Tales of Destiny 2, was developed by Telnet Japan and Wolf Team and published by Namco, with Ubisoft publishing it in Europe. It was released for the PlayStation in Japan on November 30th, 2000, and in America on September 10th, 2001. The PlayStation Portable version was released in Japan on March 3rd, 2005, in Australia on February 9th, 2006, and in Europe on February 10th, 2006. We didn't get the PSP version, but since the PSP is region-free, you can just get either the European one or the Australian one on eBay or whatever. On Game Rankings, the PSP version has a score of 82.76, the sixth highest of the series. Tales of Eternia has about as much to do with Tales of Destiny as that game had to do with Tales of Phantasia. But I guess since Destiny was the first game released in America, they were thinking of calling it the Tales of Destiny series and just numbering them. But then they decided not to do this. This can cause some confusion, as Tales of Destiny actually did get a direct sequel known as Tales of Destiny 2, but that's with a regular Arabic number, while this one uses a Roman numeral. For purposes of avoiding confusion, I will be referring to this one only as Tales of Eternia. Tales of Eternia actually reminds me a bit of Phantasy Star, as it involves a war between two planets, and you get to go to both. You play as Rid. Yes, you pronounce it Rid. I know you might have thought it was like Reed, but it's not. Rid is trying to prevent the Grand Fall, which would be the planets literally crashing into each other. There was a war between the planets, so they put up a barrier, but it's failing, and the planets are being pushed together by an outside force, which you must discover and stop. Got a lot to go through, so let's move on. Next would be another one of those Narakiri dungeon games, so let's take a look. Tales of the World Narakiri Dungeon 2 was developed by Wolf Team and Alpha System and published by Namco. It was released for the Game Boy Advance in Japan on October 25th, 2002. This one is not as ambitious as the first one with its plot, and is a bit more of a straightforward dungeon crawler. You play as Frio, who's fighting against an irrational maniac named Thanatos. Not much else to say, to be honest, so let's move on to the next main entry. Next up would be the actual sequel to Tales of Destiny, Tales of Destiny 2. It was developed by Telnet Japan and Wolf Team, with the PSP version being done by Alpha System, and it was published by Namco. Tales of Destiny 2 was directed by Mitsumi Inomata. It was released for PlayStation 2 in Japan on November 28, 2002, in Korea on March 27, 2003, and in China on August 14, 2003. The PlayStation Portable version came out in Japan only on February 15, 2007. Sadly, though this one is available in 3 different languages, none of them are English. The game takes place 18 years after the first game, and you play as a new character, Kyle, who starts off trying to save his parents' orphanage. But he discovers a lens, and the girl comes out of it looking for a hero. Yeah, ain't that just how it usually happens? The overall goal is to go back in time and fix history. Remember how Tales of Destiny had a great backstory about the war between Ethers and Earthers? You get to go back in time and be part of that. Yeah, sucks that it didn't come out here, huh? The next game would continue the storyline of Tales of Fantasia. Let's take a look. Tales of the World Summoner's Lineage was developed by Magical Company and published by Namco. It was released for the Game Boy Advance in Japan only on March 7, 2003. On Game Rankings, it has a score of 40, the lowest of the series. Now, this is actually the third in the Fantasia series, the first being the first game, of course, and the second being the first Narakiri Dungeon game. Although there was another Narakiri Dungeon game, that was a new story that didn't connect to Fantasia, but this one does, despite being Tales of the World like the last one. Let's sigh. But okay, yeah, this one is far into the future, past the first game, and you play as Foulin, a summoner apprentice who has to summon the legendary heroes from Tales of Fantasia to stem the tide of a horde of monsters coming into the world. This one plays more like a sim than an action RPG, and is probably the black sheep of the series, as you can tell by the ranking. Best we move on. Next up is the game that, if you're a more casual fan of the series, it's the one you likely started with. Let's take a look. Tales of Symphonia was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco. It was directed by Yoshido Higuchi, Kiyoshi Nagai, and Aigi Kikuchi, and produced by Makoto Yoshizumi. It was released for the GameCube in Japan on August 29, 2003, in America on July 13, 2004, and in Europe on November 19, 2004. There was also a PlayStation 2 version which came out in Japan only on November 22, 2004. The GameCube version of the game has a game ranking score of 85.47, the fifth highest in the series. Symphonia is the one that catapulted the series into popularity and also gave us a decent RPG for the GameCube, as well as being another one to spin off into its own series. It was popular here, but in Japan, Tales of Symphonia is a really big deal with loads of manga, anime, books, radio dramas, and yeah, there were video game sequels. The game also brought the action-based battle system into 3D while keeping with the general feel of the previous games in a new system called the Multi-Line Linear Motion Battle System. Yeah, more on that later. The main character this time is Lloyd, and he and his party are going all over the world gathering mana and using it to replenish the planet to regenerate it. You then find out there's another planet that is sort of an alternate reality, and this one is also in danger, but their plan to save both backfires and unleashes a ton of evil to also destroy, while also finding a way to replenish the supply of mana to both worlds. Next up would actually be the first in a series of Tales games for mobile phones. There's actually a lot of these games, but for the sake of sanity, I'm only fully covering the ones that are RPGs. The rest of them I'll talk about briefly at the end of the episode. So let's look at the first. Tales of Mobile, Tales of Tactics was developed and published by Namco and released in Japan sometime in February of 2004. This game doesn't really have a story. It's a strategy RPG similar to Final Fantasy Tactics or Fire Emblem, and it lets you use characters from several other Tales games or fight monsters in the tactical battles. Not much else to say. Next up is the next main entry, Tales of Rebirth. Let's take a look. Tales of Rebirth was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco. It was directed by Mutsumi Inomata. It was released for PlayStation 2 in Japan only on December 16, 2004, and for the PlayStation Portable in Japan only on March 19, 2008. On Game Rankings, it has a score of 92, the third highest of the series. Yeah, after Symphonia was such a big deal, I can't honestly figure out the decision not to release Tales of Rebirth outside of Japan, though Namco also has a habit of localizing these games years later, so hell, it may show up here one day somehow, which I hope so, because according to the reviews, this is a rather good one. Anyway, I don't have much information here. I know it takes place in a world that there's humans and also weird creatures called Gajumas, and the main character is a guy named Vig, whose village gets overrun in a military siege, but other than that, not a whole lot. I guess this one sold okay, but from what I read, it didn't do as well as they'd hoped, so maybe that's why it stayed in Japan. Next up is another Narakiri Dungeon game, so let's take a look at that. Tales of the World Narakiri Dungeon 3 was developed by Alpha System and published by Namco. It was released for the Game Boy Advance in Japan only on January 6, 2005. This one's weird. It, once again, is one of those weird cosplay RPGs where you dress up as things to become them, but the storyline is really fucked up. In this one, all of the Tales games exist, but not as video games, but as books. So apparently this is a world where, for example, Tales of Symphonia and Tales of Destiny are not two examples of games, but two novels. You play as this kid Frio and his sister, who are obsessed with the Tales books and dress up as the characters, and then they gain their Narakiri powers to fight a real-life evil, and they use their super cosplay powers to become the characters from the books, which to us are games, and you know what? I can't talk about this anymore. It's making me vomit my sanity out of my eyeballs. Next game. So, here's another mobile game. Tales of Breaker was developed and published by Namco, and that's about all the information I have. Literally, I didn't even put a release date here because it may have come out sometime in January of 2005, but I wasn't able to fully verify that. The story is a really generic RPG. A teenage girl named Mika travels the world uncovering her past and fighting a vague evil. This one, rather than being a tactical RPG like the last mobile game, actually plays more like the traditional Tales games. Not much else to say, really. Let's move on to the next main game in the series. Tales of Legendia was developed by Namco and Project Melphis, and of course published by Namco. It was produced by Jun Toyota. It was released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan on August 25, 2005, in Korea on October 12, 2005, and in America on February 7, 2006. On Game Rankings, it has a score of 72.83, the 14th highest of the series. Well, finally we get another one in America, and finally one for the PlayStation 2. Remember that Tales of Destiny 2, the PlayStation 2 version of Symphonia, and Tales of Rebirth were all Japan only. This time the battle system was tweaked a bit. It's once again only 2D for the battles, but it plays more like a fighting game. Yes, really. In Legendia you play as a character named Senel who's on board the Legacy, a huge ship the size of a nation that sails around the planet, mostly covered in water. The entire game takes place on this huge, improbable vessel, though there are a race of aquatic people that don't need to live on land. Like most Tales games, it starts with a smaller adventure that leads to a grander one. In this case, you start off trying to rescue your friend Shirley from a bandit, but Shirley, arriving on the Legacy, is also coincided with a mysterious beam of light, which lead a lot of people to believe that she is their chosen leader who can bring them to prosperity. And it turns out the bandit knew this and was actually trying to protect her from being captured by the real bad guys, who do wind up capturing her anyway. Nice job, Knob. Of course, she really is the chosen one. If you're a 15-year-old girl in a Japanese RPG and you get captured, you're either a princess or a goddess or something important. That's the way it goes. Next up, another mobile game. Let's take a look. Tales of Commons was developed and published by Namco and released for mobile phones in Japan only sometime in October of 2005. This one stars a dipshit named Alvin who is walking through a jungle for, no reason. When he hears singing, and because he's an idiot, he goes to investigate it, and, stuff happens. I don't know. I just don't have any patience or tolerance for mobile games. I'm just a curmudgeon like that. Let's move on to the next major one, Tales of the Abyss. Definitely not to be confused with War of the Abyss. Tales of the Abyss was developed by Namco Tales Studios and published by Namco Bandai. It was directed by Yoshito Higuchi and produced by Makoto Yoshizumi. It was released for PlayStation 2 in Japan on December 15, 2005, and in America on October 10, 2006. The 3DS version was released in Japan on June 30, 2011, in Australia on November 24, 2011, in Europe on November 25, 2011, and in America on February 14, 2012. The PlayStation 2 version of the game has a game ranking score of 79.95, the 8th highest of the series. Tales of the Abyss is kind of like Tales of Symphonia in that it was a big freaking deal, this time getting its own anime TV show that lasted 26 episodes and a theme song done by a popular Japanese rock group hilariously named Bump of Chicken. Yes, that happened. The battle system also goes back to being more like Tales of Symphonia, though it controls better, and you can even run in any direction. Tales of the Abyss's story is one of those weird sorts of things that would only ever work in this series. Basically, the world of Aldrund is made of 6 elements: earth, wind, fire, water, light, and shadow. Then someone up and figures out that sound is also an element somehow, and this also lets people predict the future somehow. This leads to a dominant religion, somehow, where they use the knowledge of the future to create a society that they promise will somehow turn into a utopia. Somehow. But this whole destiny trip really fucks people up and they start doing really messed up things because it's supposed to happen. This manifest destiny through time thing is known as the score. The main character Luke is involved with the score, but loses his memory and gets kidnapped, which sets a chain of events in motion that begins a war between those who support the score and those who don't. So yes, it's another teenager save the world game, but it's just that this one is kind of batshit insane. But a good kind of way. Remember Tales of Eternia, the game that was totally not a sequel to Tales of Destiny? Yeah, well, next up, it gets its own sequel, but this time it would be an online RPG, so let's take a look. Tales of Eternia Online was developed and published by Namco along with Dwango. It was directed by Mitsumi Inomata. It was released for PC only and Japan only on March 3rd, 2006. There's not a whole lot of info about the plot, other than it taking place actually during the middle of a Tales of Eternia. It had all the typical character creation and open world stuff that you'd come to expect, only the battles were the side-scrolling action types of battles that Tales fans were used to. The game, however, was not very popular, and it was taken offline after only a year, making it impossible to play unless you somehow found a private server. So let's take a look at another mobile game, Tales of Varheit. This one was developed and published by Namco, and it was released in Japan for mobile phones sometime in June of 2006. In case you're wondering, Varheit is German for truth, but since they went out of their way to use a German word, I didn't translate it to English. Not much to say. You're a teenager, you save the world, there's a theme song. This one actually got its own spin-off, Tales of Varheit Colosseum, which was sort of an add-on for the mobile app that let players battle in tournament-style battles. Next up is the next main game in the series. Sorta. Let's take a look. Tales of the Tempest was developed by Dimps and Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco Bandai. It was released for the DS in Japan only on October 26, 2006. Originally, this was the next main game in the series. There's been a shitload of games so far, but basically the core series has been Fantasia, Destiny, Eternia, Symphonia, Rebirth, Legendia, The Abyss, and The Tempest. However unusual it was for a main entry to be a handheld game, hell, it's not like it hadn't been done. Look at Dragon Quest. But along the line, Namco changed their mind. Basically, they categorize all of the Tales games as either mothership titles or escort titles. The mothership titles have nothing to do with alien spaceships, they're the ones that are the main titles, and the escort titles aren't about whores, they're spin-off sequels and supporting games. Yes, Namco doesn't do anything in a normal fashion. Anyway, originally they considered Tales of the Tempest to be a mothership title, but later they changed their mind and they made it an escort title. Oh, and yes, this one wasn't released in America, although the elite hacksaws of the world have translated it for you, so there is that. The game has many of the tropes of the typical Tales game, a bunch of teenagers, an ancient war that sprung out of a mistake, and a small village being the staging ground. Beyond that, not really much else to say, to be honest. Remember how I mentioned that there was a Tales of Destiny on the PlayStation 2? Let's take a look at that. Tales of Destiny, the remake version, was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco. It was directed by Mitsumi Inomata. It was released for the PlayStation 2 in Japan only on November 30th, 2006, and then got a re-release as the Director's Cut on January 31st, 2003. On Game Rankings, it has a score of 80, the 7th highest in the series. This one brought Tales of Destiny to 3D and redid a lot of it, especially the battle system, which is a bit like Legendia in that it's sort of like a fighting game in the battles, although this one focuses a lot on aerial moves and long combos, so it's even more like a fighting game. The Director's Cut expanded over the story even more. In a moment of extreme coolness, they even let you carry over save data from the first release to the Director's Cut. Nice guy Namco, yo. Next up, another spin-off. Here it is. Tales of the World, Radiant Mythology was developed by Alpha System and published by Namco Bandai, though the European version was published by Ubisoft. It was released for PlayStation Portable in Japan on December 31st, 2006, in America on July 17th, 2007, in Europe on September 7, 2006, and in Australia on September 6, 2007. On Game Rankings, it has a score of 67.80, the second lowest of the series. Yeah, we get the low-scoring weird ones like this, but not Tales of Rebirth? Where's the justice? Anyway, as I mentioned, Fantasia spun off into its own series that had Narakiri Dungeon as the second part, and then Summoner's Lineage as the third. However, Narakiri Dungeon 2 and 3, and even Summoner's Lineage, were also part of the Tales of the World series, which focuses on crossovers and shit. The game plays like a mixture of an online RPG and a dungeon crawler, and has a job system, and a bunch of original teenagers as well as a gaggle of kids from many of the previous games. Yeah. Let's move on. Next up, another mothership title for the DS, though they haven't changed their mind about this one yet. Tales of Innocence was developed by Alpha System and published by Namco Bandai. It was released for the DS in Japan only on December 6, 2007. There was a re-release also for the PlayStation Vita on January 26, 2012, also only in Japan. That one was called Tales of Innocence R. The Vita version is ranked by GameRankings as 73, the 13th highest in the series. This time around, battles let you run around freely like in Tales of the Abyss, but it keeps the aerial combo mania from the remake of Tales of Destiny. Man, do I even need to say it? A city at peace, a war that raged in the past, people with special abilities, a bunch of kids getting swept up in it. Yeah, I'd go into detail, but it wasn't released here, and I couldn't have played it. Damn. Well, I mentioned that Tales of Symphonia would get a sequel, so let's take a look at that now. Tales of Symphonia Dawn of the New World, known in Japan as Tales of Symphonia Night of Ratatosk, was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco Bandai. It was directed by Daigo Okamura and released for the Wii in Japan on June 26, 2008, in America on November 11, 2008, in Europe on November 13, 2009, and in Australia on November 26, 2009. On GameRankings, it has a score of 69.24, the third lowest of the series. Well, this is the sequel that Tales of Symphonia fans waited for, though it doesn't fully live up to the original game by any means. It's still not a bad game. The battle system is kind of like Tales of Innocence, and it has a lot of new features such as training monsters to fight alongside you and a new elemental grid system. The story? A city caught in between two warring factions, a young boy named Emil, though this one is a bit more personal. The main character Emil goes to live with some relatives who abuse him, and the people in the city treat him like crap, which turns him into a shy introvert, and a lot of the subplot is about him coming out of his shell. Overall, it's very much almost like its own game, which probably would have benefited from not being connected to one of the most popular ones in the series. The next game would be another main entry in the series, and another good one, so let's take a look. Tales of Vesperia was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco Bandai, though the European version was published by Atari. It was directed by Yoshito Higuchi and released for the Xbox 360 in Japan on August 7, 2008, in America on August 26, 2008, and in Europe on June 26, 2009. The PlayStation 3 version was released in Japan on September 17, 2009. The PS3 version never came out in the rest of the world. The PS3 version on GameRankings has a score of 91, the fourth highest of the series. The battle system in this one is a lot like Tales of the Abyss, but with more elements of an online RPG. For example, if you're fighting monsters and there are nearby monsters, they may join the battle. In the story, the people on the planet rely heavily on technology called Blastia, which can pretty much do anything from running day-to-day life to enhancing combat ability. But a Blastia core goes missing, causing a flood. The main character, Yuri, tries to solve the crime, but is accused of it himself and sent to jail, where he meets the obligatory teenage girl who kicks off the plot. The first part of the game is all about catching the thief who stole the Blastia core, but later the game has the characters doubting the society they live in, and they give up their citizenship in order to escape the current regime and use the recovered core to start their own society. But of course it's never that easy, is it? Next up is another handheld entry that's also a mothership title. So far they haven't changed their mind on this one either, so let's take a look. Tales of Hearts, the Vita version is called Tales of Hearts R, was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco Bandai. It was directed by Kazuhisa Umi and produced by Hideo Baba. The DS version came out in Japan only on December 18, 2008. The Vita version came out also in Japan only on March 7, 2013. The DS version on GameRankings has a score of 93, the second highest of the series. So yes, the second best game in the series according to GameRankings. Did we get it? Nope. Of course not. That would just be insanity. Anyway, from what I could tell, the story revolves around powerful weapons called somas. The main girl, Amber Hearts, was looking for a soma with her brother, but they get attacked and escape via water, where they come to a village where they meet the main character, Shing. So yeah, a boy, a girl, a village, a man, a city, a lighthouse. Wait, that's another series. Yeah, I haven't played this one. Namco, why you no release in America? Up next, another spin-off. Tales of the World, Radiant Mythology 2, was developed by Alpha System and published by Namco. It was released for the PlayStation Portable in Japan only on January 29, 2009. I don't know much about this one, but it's pretty much like the first Radiant Mythology, only this time with more character classes and even more characters from the various Tales games appearing. Over 50, in fact. So, next game? Next up would be another PSP crossover, but this time a very different type. Let's take a look. Tales of Versus was developed by Namco Tales Studios and Matrix Software and published by Namco Bandai. It was released for the PlayStation Portable in Japan only on August 6, 2009. Well, as you might have noticed, I had previously compared the battle system of a few of the games to being like a fighting game, so I suppose a real fighting game with Tales characters was a natural thing. Too bad we didn't get it. 35 characters ranging from the original Tales of Phantasia up to Tales of Hearts appeared, as well as some that would also appear in a minigame within Tales of Versus known as Tales of Wallbreaker. We didn't get it, so unfortunately I don't have much to say, so it's time to once again move on. Next up would be another remake, but not of one of the really popular games, but rather of the first Narakiri Dungeon game. Let's take a look. Tales of Phantasia Narakiri Dungeon Cross was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco Bandai. It was directed by Tomomi Masabunichi and produced by Shinichiro Okamoto and Ryuji Odante. It was released for the PlayStation Portable in Japan only on August 5, 2010. This one is actually not only a remake of Tales of Phantasia Narakiri Dungeon, but also it contains Tales of Phantasia Cross, a remake of the original game. So, it's a pretty good package, just, only in Japan. Let's move on. Here's the next Mothership title. Tales of Graces, also known as Tales of Graces F, was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco Bandai. It was produced by Hideo Baba. It was released for the Wii in Japan only on December 10, 2009. The PlayStation 3 version was released in Japan on December 2, 2010, in America on March 13, 2012, and in Europe on August 31, 2012. The PlayStation 3 version is the one called Tales of Graces F. Apparently F denotes a PS3 release, like R denotes a PSP release. Okay, sure. The PS3 version on GameRankings has a score of 78.77, the 9th highest in the series. I haven't played this game, as I don't have the PlayStation 3 and the Wii version didn't come out here, but from what I can tell you, play as another group of kids. This time they befriend this girl named Sophie and a prince named Richard, who invites them to this castle. They're then attacked by a monster and defeated, but they manage to survive when Sophie sacrifices herself. Turns out it was part of a plot to secure one of them as part of a political adoption, and the whole thing went awry. Then later on, there's the usual stuff with adventures all over the world, wars between nations, and of course trying to heal Sophie, and of course saving the world from a monster invasion. Next up, another crossover game. Let's take a look. Tales of the World Radiant Mythology 3 was developed by Alpha System and published by Namco. It was released on the PlayStation Portable in Japan only on February 10, 2011. So what's to say? It's basically the same idea as the first two Radiant Mythology games, but with even more characters from the Tales series, this time up to and including Tales of Graces, and even more character classes to play as. None of these games came out here, and there's not much to talk about anyway, so let's move on to the next Mothership game. Tales of Xillia was developed by Namco Tales Studio and published by Namco Bandai Games. It was directed by Hideo Baba and released on the PlayStation 3 in Japan on September 8, 2011. It hasn't yet come out in America or Europe, but it's set to come out, this week. August 6th in America and the 9th in Europe. There's no game ranking score yet, but after the game is released, I'm sure that will change. There may be no score, but this is considered to be one of the best ones, and the initial reluctance on Namco's part to release it outside of Japan has made many an RPG fan insane, as this has a load of buzz. Hell, it already has a sequel in Japan, and honestly, we're not usually that far behind on games. Tales of Xillia has a world that is split into two, Res Maxia and Elenpios. One is a world of magic, and the other of technology. Elenpios is the technological world, and it's been infiltrating Res Maxia secretly and conducting acts of terrorism via the organization Exodus, who are trying to destroy the barrier between the two worlds so they can raise Res Maxia and gain its resources. The part with the teenagers saving the world comes a bit later. This time you're a medical student named Jude who discovers a weapon called the Lance, which is meant to destroy the barrier, and, well, him and his friends decide to do something about it. What do you think they'd do? This one got a lot of attention. There was a manga, several books, CDs, and whatnot. And as I said, a long campaign in America to get it released here, which it will, in a few days. But in the meantime, let's move on to another spin-off game. Tales of the Heroes Twin Brave was developed and published by Namco Bandai and released for the PlayStation Portable in Japan only on February 23, 2012. Tales of the Heroes is kind of like Tales of Versus, only instead of a one-on-one fighting game like Street Fighter, it's a beat-em-up like Final Fight, or more accurately, like Dynasty Warriors. It has characters from all over the series, similar to the Tales of the World games, from Phantasia all the way up to Xillia, though this one was slightly less successful than Tales of Versus. Next up, it seems that it's impossible to have a really iconic series without eventually making it into a board game, so yeah, they did that. Let's take a look. Tales of the World Dice Adventure was developed and published by Namco. It was a browser game released in Japan only on April 26, 2012. Since this one was a browser game that you played by going to a web address, I suppose that anyone who knew the address and could either understand Japanese or at least figure out what the hell is going on could play this. This one isn't so much like Mario Party or Fortune Street, but more like that Mega Man one for the Famicom, or the board games found in Dragon Quest. You go around the board with dice rolls, meeting characters and moving the story along. Occasionally there are battles. The game was free to play, but it had microtransactions. Yeah. Let's move on. Well, a free-to-play dice browser game with transactions, the only thing left to really make this modern would be an app for iOS and Android, right? Well, yeah, that was done too. Here it is. Tales of the World Tactics Union was developed and published by Namco Bandai and released for Android devices in Japan only on July 2nd, 2012, and for iOS devices in Japan only sometime in January of 2012. This one is essentially another shot at doing Tales of Tactics, just with more modern graphics and more characters. While Tales of Tactics was a bit like Fire Emblem in its gameplay and also didn't have a story, this one plays more like Final Fantasy Tactics and does have a story with its own original characters. However, it's a pretty casual game, all things said. It was designed to get people who aren't into tactical RPGs into them. There was also DLC that gave it extra levels and characters from Tales of Innocence and Tales of Vesperia. Well, there's only one more game to cover, and that's the sequel to Tales of Xillia, so let's take a look. Tales of Xillia 2 was developed and published by Namco Bandai and was directed by Hideo Baba. It was released for the PlayStation 3 in Japan only on November 1st, 2012. This one has not yet been released in America or Europe, but from what I understand, they are working on localizing it, and it should reach both territories sometime in 2014. My guess is they weren't sure on whether or not they wanted to release it outside of Japan at first, so they didn't start the localization process until the game was already released. The main character in this one is Ludger, who is working for a company that hires him to travel to alternate timelines to prevent them from happening to ensure the company's success. Ludger is working off a debt for his medical bills after he got himself injured saving the main girl, Elle. Beyond that, I won't say much as you probably will get to play this, just, next year. Well, that's it for the series, though they've already announced the next product, a remake of Tales of Symphonia that will also contain its sequel, all as one game. This one is going to be called Tales of Symphonia Chronicles and will be released for PlayStation 3 in Japan later this year, and next year the rest of the world. One interesting thing about the Tales series is that Namco likes to make up a lot of ridiculously specific genres for each game in the series, and also they like to give the battle system a new name in most of the games, despite the fact that it's always minor tweaks or small innovations that evolve it over time. According to these Appleheads, each game in the series has its own genre that no other game occupies and has a unique battle system that most other games don't do. Just for kicks, I decided to go over them here at the end of the episode because I find them amusing. Tales of Phantasia is the legendary RPG, and the remake is the legendary RPG embellished with voices, while the battle system was called the Linear Motion Battle System. Tales of Destiny's genre is the name Destiny's RPG. Yes, really. And the battle system was the same. They hadn't thought of giving it a new name yet. Narakiri Dungeon is a dungeon RPG. They just had to do that, even with the spin-offs. It also used the same battle system. Tales of Eternia was called RPG of Eternity and Bonds, and used that same battle system. Narakiri Dungeon 2, as I mentioned, is a cosplay RPG and introduced the condensed linear motion battle system. Tales of Destiny 2 was an RPG to release Destiny, and it goes back to the old linear motion battle system. Summoner's Lineage was called a fantasy simulation RPG. Tales of Symphonia was called To Resonate With You RPG and gave us the multi-line linear motion battle system. Tales of Rebirth was called an RPG where you will be reborn and used the 3-line linear motion battle system. Narakiri Dungeon 3 is a cosplay SRPG. Tales of Legendia was an RPG where bonds spin legends and used the crossover linear motion battle system. Tales of the Abyss was called a To Know the Meaning of One's Birth RPG. Yeah, it's starting to get silly. And that one called the battle system Flex Range Linear Motion Battle System. Tales of the Tempest was an RPG that awakens the soul and used the 3-on-3 linear motion battle system. Tales of Innocence was called an RPG to tie thoughts together and called the battle system the Dimension Stride linear motion battle system. Phew. Tales of Symphonia Dawn of the New World was called an RPG to believe in resonating hearts, and the battle system was called the Flex Range Element Enhanced Linear Motion Battle System. God damn. Tales of Vesperia was called an RPG to enforce justice and used the Evolved Flex Range Linear Motion Battle System. Tales of Hearts was called an RPG to meet the heart, and used the Combination Aerial Linear Motion Battle System. Narakiri Dungeon Cross didn't get a new RPG name, but the battle system was changed to the Cross Arts Aerial Linear Motion Battle System. Tales of Graces was called an RPG to know the strength to protect, and used the Style Shift Linear Motion Battle System. Tales of Xillia was called RPG of Unwavering Convictions, and used the Dual Raid Linear Motion Battle System. And finally, Tales of Xillia 2 was called an RPG where your choices spin the future, and the system is called the Cross Dual Raid Linear Motion Battle System. After hearing all that, you can only come to one conclusion. Namco are insane. So, is that all the games? Nope. There's actually so many mobile games in this series that I can never cover them all and stay sane, but that's why I picked the ones that aren't RPGs. But there are lots of games that don't necessarily fit into the series' style of gameplay, but use its characters, locations, or logos. These games all fall under the banner of Tales of Mobile, and are usually mini-games pulled from the larger games, or just using the characters. Some of these include Kramel Check, Kramel Lab, Groovy Arch, Klondike, Muse Great Adventure, a version of Reversey, Scramble Land, Tales of Quiz, Tales of Wonder Casino, and Whiz Battle. And there might even be more, but those are just the ones I found the names of. Anyway, that's it for the Tales of series. Join me in 2 weeks. Yes, I said 2 weeks because the season finale is a big one and I'm going to need extra time working on it. We're going to take a look at one of the greatest series of action games ever, and I'll be covering 74 games. Fuck yeah, see you then.